Welcome to Studium to Studio with your local lay Dominicans. We'll be discussing some of the gems we discovered in our studium, where we share the fruits of our contemplation and the joy of the gospel message. Representing our St. Albert the Great lay Dominican chapter and co-host of today's show are myself, Cheryl Drozda,
Jeff Drozda,
and Charles Richard.
And today we're going to talk about a subject that is near and dear to our heart, and it's about literature. And this might seem like a surprise because we are talking about spiritual stuff, and we are today, actually. As a matter of fact, the Pope has written a letter about this, and that's what's inspired our discussion. But he's a little bit preaching to the choir, and we'll start singing here in a minute about that. But after 10 years of being part of a Well-Read Mom group, which is a literature group, it's Catholic run, but it's any and every type of literature with a focus. And in discussion for the last 10 years, I've been part of one, and it has been one of the most spiritual things that I've participated in.
That's wonderful. Yeah, the letter, you can look it up online, and I really do urge listeners to take the time to look it up and read it. It's called A Letter of His Holiness Pope Francis on the Role of Literature in Formation. And initially it was written and directed for seminarians, and the Pope's encouragement that literature, the study of literature, should be an important part of seminary formation. But he also added at the beginning of the letter a statement that says, really, this is true of all formation for lay people as well as for the formation of priests. And so it's a letter really for all of us about the incredibly important role that literature can play in our spiritual formation.
Just for example, I think he discusses how it really draws us into ourselves, like considering our own interior practices, as well as being more empathetic with others. And that's just one example that he gives. But I find this is so true in our group. We just literally just met this week on, and it's the Year of the Father. We did a couple of poems on fatherhood. And it really helped me to consider how grateful I was for my father, and to consider to just do a better job at being a good daughter. That's just one example of how these things can, when you take time to read a really beautiful, good and true, work of art, especially literature, that it can really touch your heart more than almost anything.
That's right. I think that it's an especially timely topic that the Holy Father has reminded us of, because I work, of course, as an educator at a public university, and some of the academic publications that are coming out now are raising questions like, are we witnessing the death of reading among young people because of the prevalence of screens, and social media and so on and so forth. And I have found, just in the last 30 years of my teaching, a dramatic shift among young people in their tendencies to stay away from literature. Sometimes at the beginning of a semester, I'll ask students, we'll go around the room and I'll ask them, well, tell me about the last book you read, thinking that maybe they're going to tell me about their summer reading or something. I have students, and no small number of them, that'll say, oh, the last book I read, I think that was probably Harry Potter. And I'm thinking, wow, you've arrived in college for a university education, and the last book you read was a children's book. And so it really has illustrated to me just how much screens and the internet and all of these other kinds of sources have overshadowed the incredible power of literature. And so I think it's very timely that the Pope reminds us that literature is an important part of human formation.
And do you think that in education in general, elementary and high school, it's just less prevalent too? Because I can only speak for our kids. They go to John Paul the Great Academy, and literature is forefront. And I don't have this issue because all of our kids love to read, and They're very well read. Yeah. So I go to them with questions, literary questions. And I even went to our daughter to ask her some questions about this letter, which she helped me with. So we are, I don't have that issue with our kids, but I do think that in most schools that literature is not as prevalent.
Yes. And part of the problem that professional educators are recognizing is that even when students do read, they have such short attention spans that they can't sustain large blocks of reading at a time. They can't read whole novels, for example. And part of that is the way that literature is taught in high schools. So frequently, high schools are geared toward having students pass standardized tests, right, to get into the best college possible. Well, those literature and reading components of those standardized tests really are designed with just a small excerpt for students to read. It's a few paragraphs, few hundred words maybe, and then answer questions on. And so students who teach to the test are really only exposing students a lot of times to very short, small excerpts from reading and fragmentary impression of reading, which, if students can't sustain themselves through the span of a larger narrative, they really are only getting a fragmentary experience at best of reading.
So I guess one remedy for that too that I have to recommend is How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. Yes. I mean, it's the thing that changed my perspective on reading, because I really didn't read a lot until I read that book, because I think I was intimidated by large, voluminous books or whatever. And after I read that, kind of gave me that freedom to, so if you haven't read that book, How to Read a Book, it's definitely a humbling book to carry around. As people stare at your title, How to Read a Book. Yeah. But it's also a very effective at helping you to get over that and to read whole. You had mentioned the partial parts, and after I read that book, I was teaching a literature class for a homeschooling group. And so I insisted on getting through long bodies of work. Right. We did the Odyssey, Thucydides. It happened to be ancient Greek timing, but we did whole works of those things, and they loved it. They loved reading it. That I don't think they realized they could. And people are like, "Oh my goodness, I didn't know they would ever do that," but they actually loved it.
Yeah, and some of that comes down to mechanics. In schools today, I don't think that there's nearly the kind of emphasis on grammar and sentence structure and so forth, that the boring stuff that a lot of us kind of dread when we're in school. But it becomes invaluable because when you try to present students with older works of literature, they run across lengthy, complex sentences that, that was the way people wrote, as much as just a century or so ago. And they find that they can't make sense of these long, complicated sentences because they don't comprehend the grammar, the syntax. And it's not a single problem that we can isolate. It's a larger, bigger problem of reading itself, and also the value of reading. I think a lot of students don't recognize that.
That's what I'm anxious for you to tell our listeners about, because I know there's some people out there probably like, well, what? So they read a good book, or so I think there's a shift, and a lot of people. A little bit younger than us, don't actually see the value of their kids reading some of these books. So you want to tell them why this is such an important part of formation.
Yeah, I think, it's part of a bigger issue in education, especially in American education, where there's such an emphasis, and I'll just confine my remarks to university education, but there's such an emphasis on education as a means to make a living, literally, and it's no exaggeration when I say this, a lot of my students regard a diploma as equivalent to a work permit. I've got to get my diploma so that I can get out in the world, get a good paying job. And then when they're presented with courses that they don't see the relevance for that, so maybe I might have an engineering student or a business student in my class, and they're taking my literature class because they have to. It's required by the university to graduate. And they see it as just simply an obstacle they have to overcome, get the credit for in order to get their diploma. And I had a situation a couple of years ago where I had an unusually large number of students that were turning in essays that were Chat GPT generated, AI generated essays. And I was just kind of baffled as to why that was. And it happened that semester, my son was in the class. The other students didn't know that he was my son. So I pulled him aside one day and I said, can you tell me why? Why do these otherwise smart kids, these are not stupid people. Why do they feel they need to cheat in order to pass a literature class? And my son said, well, Dad, they don't see it as having any value. How is this going to help me make a living? Well, I guess, if I'm going to become an English teacher, maybe this has value, but, they don't see that it has worth. And so it changed the whole way that I teach literature. Nowadays, I begin by getting students to consider why we read. What's the point of a humanities class, a liberal arts class? And I guess to sum it up, what I try and remind students is that if you're in school for engineering or nursing or business or any of these other kinds of professional training educations, that's great. That's very, very important, and it's a vital role that you play in society. And it's important to learn things that are going to help you make a good living, especially with the economy the way that it is. So I'm not trying to take anything away from that, but I want to remind students at the beginning of a literature class that while your other classes will help you make a good living, a humanities class, a literature class will help you make a good life and help you to become a human being.
Just like it's the name, humanities. It is what it says. It helps us to be more human, be more in touch with other people, other cultures, and even with ourselves.
That's right. I'll often point out to students, if you're lucky, you might have 70, 80 years on this earth, and you'll, maybe even with the richest of lives that you might live, you're still only getting a small taste of the human experience, a narrowly defined taste of the human experience in your particular era, the time that you live in. When you read literature, especially truly great classical literature, you're able to gain an insight into the larger breadth of human experience. You vicariously experience the emotions and the tragedies or the triumphs of other human beings rendered through art. And it's a way of making your own life much bigger, much broader than just your own personally lived experience.
I think it was Chesterton who said that we study the Iliad because all of life is a battle. We study the Odyssey because all of life is a journey. And we read the book of Job because all of life is a riddle. So it does give us the different perspective that we wouldn't have. If we've never been to battle, we have no concept of that unless we read something about what takes place in a battle. If we've never had these experiences before, if we've never sailed on a ship across the ocean, which I will venture to say most of us haven't, we probably would have no idea what takes place, especially if it was back in the 1700s or something like that. So literature gives us the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, which is always a good lesson in life.
Absolutely. It's a way of developing empathy and understanding other people and their motivations and so forth. So I love, for example, before the show started, we were talking a little bit about Dostoevsky, and I love his classic 19th century novel, Crime and Punishment, in which he tells the story of a young student who commits a murder. And he's an otherwise a student who's aspiring to do great things and help humanity, But he sees this murder as necessary. It's a robbery, in order that he can get the funds that he needs to complete his education and so on. I've never committed a murder, but I do know what it's like to have done something wrong and to try and live with it. And so in reading this story, Crime and Punishment, where we are looking at things through the eyes of this very guilt-ridden and conscience-haunted young person who's committed this murder, we gain insight. We gain a certain perspective that allows us to love others.
Because otherwise it would seem he would be unlovable.
Correct.
But when you read this book, and I've read it, I love it, you actually realize that you can really care for someone who would do something like this.
Exactly.
And you understand that the humanity behind it and what he had to go through.
And it's humbling. It reminds you that you're capable
Yes.
of just as much evil as anyone else.
You're listening to Studium to Studio at Christ Our King Catholic Radio here in Acadiana. We are your Third Order lay Dominicans, and we want to thank Stein Lumber for their sponsorship of our show every Thursday at 4 p.m. Today we were talking about the Holy Father, Pope Francis, his letter on the role of literature in formation. Now, the original intent of this letter that came out this past July, the intent was for spiritual directors, for priests, for seminarians, and the intent was to have them focus a little bit more on experiences that they would otherwise not have, because obviously priests are not married, they don't have children, and so how can you have a well-formed seminarian, a well-formed priest? And the Holy Father is saying that through literature, this is how we can enhance the formation of our seminarians and future priests. And as a matter of fact, there are a few dioceses across the country currently that have incorporated the Great Book series into their diocesan formation for deacons and for seminarians. And they think it's extremely important because we have to be able to understand the truths about the human condition. And as we talked about earlier, as you said, Charles, we can only experience ourselves such a small, minor portion of the human experience. And this is what I think the Holy Father is trying to do with formation of priests and seminarians, but also formation as ourselves, as we look to hopefully see the gates of heaven at some point in some way at the end of our lives. And Charles, you had this experience that you have not only read literature, you teach literature, and so you are forming those minds of mush, I guess you could say. And it's just, you bring that experience, and we're just glad you're here to talk about it.
Yeah, it's very true. So one of my favorite books to teach, I get the privilege of teaching a Louisiana literature class. And so students, who are from here in Louisiana, they tend to sit up and pay more attention because it's their books about their home. And so one of the books that I love teaching was one by the wonderful novelist Ernest Gaines. He's deceased now, but he was the writer in residence at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. And this book that he wrote, probably his most famous, I think, is A Lesson Before Dying. And just very briefly, it tells the story of this young man growing up in the Jim Crow South in the 1940s. And this young man is at the wrong place, the wrong time, and a murder happens that he is not responsible for at all, but he ends up being blamed for it. And he's tried and convicted of this. And this is a young African-American man who had very little education. He was a little intellectually slow. And when it came to the sentencing, his defense attorney argued to the jury it would be wrong to put this man in the electric chair because he really doesn't even understand what's happening around him. And whatever else was said at the trial, one thing just rang in the ears of this young man convicted of murder. His defense attorney said to the jury, "Why, you do no better putting a hog in the electric chair. And that stuck with that young man, and he realized that he internalized, maybe I should say, the ideas that he and other poor black people like him were really no more than animals. And so the rest of the book, A Lesson Before Dying, is about a school teacher who comes to visit him regularly in prison while he's on death row to try and teach him that no, he is not a hog. He is no mere animal. He is a man. And so the book is really about the struggle to learn one's worth as a human individual, regardless of your race, class, or anything else. And in a lot of ways, that's what teaching literature is all about for me, is helping young people realize the fullness of their humanity. And we can't do that on our own. We simply can't do that on our own. We learn to be human by observing other human beings, and that's what literature offers us.
Right, in the letter that we're referring to, Pope Francis's letter on literature and formation, he actually has a section called Never a Disembodied Christ. And I thought that was a beautiful section on how, we want to enflesh Christ in other people, and this literature actually helps us to see Christ in others, regardless of their situation. And I think, again, I'm going to reiterate what Charles said earlier. It's worth your time. It's only about 10 pages printed out. It's an excellent inspiration for everybody to read more literature and why we should.
Yeah, I would say that among Pope Francis's encyclicals and other writings, this one is perhaps nearest and dearest to my heart. And in it, there's a line that he offers. He refers to the, quote, privileged access which literature grants to the very heart of human culture, and more specifically, to the heart of every individual, end quote. And I find that is what students need to understand when it comes to why they have to study literature, why they're required to take humanities courses, when all they really want is to get out into the workplace and earn a living. And so just like the young man in A Lesson Before Dying has to be taught the fullness of his humanity, I think the same is true of young people who are so often programmed by society to think of themselves as nothing more than earners and consumers. But there's so much more to life than that.
And the dignity of each human is something that really a lot of these books instill, especially good classic literature.
Yeah.
In the letter, the Holy Father refers to various authors and poets, and one of whom he references, and I hope I'll get the name right, is Jorge Luis Borges, who, of course, an Argentinian, would be in this letter, of course. But what he focuses on in his reference to this poet and author is that you are able to hear another person's voice. And I found that interesting. I'm like, well, why is this so important? Because we hear voices all the time. What's so unique about this? Until I found out that the author, the poet, was blind. And so everything that he wrote about was from the perspective of another person's voice, listening to another person's voice. And of course, we who do have sight, I think, take that for granted. And once again, it's putting yourself in another person's shoes that otherwise we would not have had that experience.
Yeah, and it's very consistent with a larger theme of Francis's pontificate. He's reminding Catholics constantly for the need to listen to each other, and that is part of the near the core of Christ's message. We have to stand in the shoes of our fellows, and our brothers and sisters. And I think that without literature, the voices that we hear are mostly our own. And what we listen for example, on social media and other things, are people who will echo what we already think. Literature challenges that. Literature forces you to listen to other voices, to see other perspectives. perspectives that you might disagree with, but you need to understand at the very least to be able to step outside of your own narrow experience and learn to love the least among us.
One line that I'm looking at in the letter in paragraph 34, he says, "We develop an imaginative empathy that enables us to identify with how others see, experience, and respond to reality. Without such empathy, there can be no solidarity, sharing, compassion, mercy. In reading, we discover that our feelings are not simply our own, they're universal, and so even the most destitute person does not feel alone." And that's another thing is literature is fulfilling for ourselves, too. I mean, we're talking about, and it does a lot for discernment of others and helping to be empathetic. But honestly, it helps us to work on ourselves too. It helps us to not feel alone. It helps us to realize, like you said earlier, we've done things wrong and we can relate to this person. So how did they get out of that? How should we look at it? There's so many. It's a remedy for so many things.
One of the reasons that Shakespeare remains at the sort of the heart of English literature is because when you take his entire body of work, all of his plays, you have in front of you almost an encyclopedia of the human experience. The various characters, who has not experienced the self-doubt that is embodied in a character like Hamlet, the indecisiveness. And so I think you're exactly right, Cheryl, in saying that literature helps us to feel not so alone. It makes us part of the larger body of humanity as a full participant. And we find ourselves in reading about others.
And it's so important in today's society where our youth and even adults are spending so much time on social media, on the phones, and on the internet. And even though with all that out there, they're finding themselves alone. And the Holy Father talks about how literature can answer that loneliness and overcome that anxiety that people in our society are currently having. And I also, appreciate, of course, as Dominicans, we're also always searching for the truth. And, truth transcends all time and space. And we can actually find truth through experiencing other people's plights, and through literature. This is one way to do that.
Yeah, I mean, those old-fashioned ideas of truth, beauty, and goodness, they seem so quaint to a lot of people today and maybe out of date, but they are timeless. And that's what we find in good classical literature especially, is learning to recognize the truth, the goodness, and the beauty in lives that maybe we'll never live, but are so important anyway. And, one of the things also that the Holy Father talks about at the beginning of the letter is how books, let's see, how does he say it? A book demands greater personal engagement on the part of readers than other kinds of media. So I'm also a filmmaker, and I know that when you sit down to watch a movie in a theater, it's a very passive experience. You don't have the time, for example, to stop and consider something that a character has just said. A book, on the other hand, you might pause. You might go back, reread the line. You might go back and reread the sentence. You might make little notes in the margin. So it requires a more active engagement than other forms of media and storytelling. So like any search for truth, beauty, and goodness, it takes a little bit more effort. And I think sometimes people are put off by that effort because we're more accustomed to that passive reception. But the effort is so worth it, and the enjoyment that you derive from good literature is what the payoff is for that.
Well, that was great. And I'll probably finish with this last quote by C.S. Lewis, which our Holy Father quotes: "In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself, and I am never more myself than when I do."
Oh, yeah.
So remember to stand firm in the absolute truth, Jesus Christ, because only the truth bears grace.
Live through time. freedom, passed through fire, broke my heart, wounded desire, changed my life, fixed the past, stared at death and it stared back, standing fast in the light of the world.